Hey YouTube, I'm Kyle. I'm the executive editor of Thrifty Traveler, and I am just so grateful today to be joined by Brian Summers from Skift. Brian is the senior aviation business editor for Skift, and I really think truly one of the best reporters to follow in terms of trying to keep track of all of the crazy changes in the airline industry. Brian, thank you so much for joining us and doing this Q&A with us.
Thanks for having me, Kyle. It's good to be here to talk airplanes.
So before we dive in, just give everyone kind of a brief intro about your work, what you do, and give yourself a little shameless plug for how people can follow you and read your work.
Sure. I work at Skift. We cover all elements of the travel industry. I, of course, cover airplanes. I am a journalist through and through, but I love airplanes. I always have. I'm a bit of a romantic about airplanes. And what we've been seeing recently is kind of sad for me and people like me because the airline industry is changing. It's going to be here forever, but coming out of this pandemic, it's going to look a lot different than it did coming in. And some of the things that we remember from 20 or 30 years ago, routes, airplanes, things that stuck around for a long time, they're probably gone and not coming back. Sad, but I guess progress is the name of the game, right?
Yeah, we gotta just hope that it's progress and not backsliding. So, everyone who's tuning in, thank you so much for tuning in. Please drop some questions in the chat here, and I'll pull them up on screen and have Brian do his best to answer them. But Brian, I'm going to be selfish because I have a ton of questions for you as well. And you've been brave enough to volunteer to let us pick your brain. And so to start, I just have to say, you have been probably more bearish than most about how airlines would get through this. Even as there were some signs of recovery in the spring as travel numbers started to tick up and airlines talked about bookings coming in again, you kind of pumped the brakes. So I have to ask, is it hard to say I told you so as things have started to slip in the summer?
Well, one of my favorite people in the airline industry is Scott Kirby, the newish CEO of United Airlines. And when Scott is right, he never hesitates to tell people that he was right. So I have to say, put on my Scott Kirby hat and say, yeah, I suppose it feels sort of good. I mean, I hate what has happened to the industry, but to me, from my house here in Los Angeles, it all seems so obvious. It was like US airlines and businesses in general had forgotten that there was a virus out there. Look, I'm not a public health expert. I don't study viruses. I get that. But I do know that the virus is here. It's not going anywhere. And as long as that's the case, I don't see how we can get back to normal. So a lot of the stuff that's happened later in the summer didn't surprise me. And it didn't surprise a lot of people in airlines. But there were a few airlines that got ahead of their skis there for a little bit and tried to add more flying than people thought maybe was prudent.
Yeah, expand on that a little bit. So, what airlines do you think maybe might have erred in going a little bit further than the travel demand or the battle with a public health crisis might have supported?
Well, Kyle, there are a couple airlines, and they're both based in Texas, and I'm not sure that's just by chance. I don't know if we have viewers from outside of the United States here, but the U.S. Response to the pandemic has been very regional in focus. And where I live in California and in New York and Illinois, where United Airlines is, people have been taking this virus very seriously. There have been local lockdown orders. Things are closed. A lot of schools aren't going to go back to school. And then you saw Texas. And by the early May, it just seemed like people in Texas were like, okay, let's get back to work. Let's get the economy going again. And we do have two airlines based in Texas, American Airlines and Southwest. They're both based in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And sort of immediately when that happened in May, Southwest created a fare sale. They had you could earn extra rapid rewards points. American did something similar, and they were just off to the races. And for a while, they were like, everything is working great, guys. And I was a little bit skeptical at the time. And they were like, well, the Gulf Coast of Florida has reopened its beaches, so we're going to add so much capacity there. I never understood it. I mean, this virus is mobile. People get on airplanes, they go from one place to the next. If there's no hot spot in one place now, it doesn't mean there won't be one in 2 weeks. And lo and behold, this strategy worked okay for May and June, and by July, we've all been reading the news in the United States, and Travelers have pulled back. They're not booking as many plane tickets. They're canceling plane tickets. And Southwest and Americans say, you know what we saw, it doesn't quite exist anymore.
So I have to bring this up. American Airlines Chief Revenue Officer Vasu Raja gave what's now, I don't know if we call it famous or infamous, an interview
Yeah.
to Plain Business Banter, where he said that um, American was able to break even, so they could, stop losing money operating an individual flight and start to turn a small profit um, on a 9% load factor, meaning 9% of the seats on those flights were full. The industry norm is usually somewhere between 60, 70%, maybe a little more than that. What do you make of that? Was that true? Was the combination of CARES Act funding, covering airlines' employment expenses and low
Yeah.
fuel, is that really enough to bring it down to 9%, or what do you
So
make of
I
this?
talked to somebody about that from a rival airline, and this other executive said, no, 9% is a little bit of a stretch, but it's not as much of a stretch as you would think. JetBlue on their earnings call yesterday said it's about 20 to 30% break even load factor. And the reason for that is, as you said, the government is paying most employee salaries, so you don't have to worry about paying your people, and fuel is very cheap. And the other thing that we have to mention, and I hadn't thought about this until recently, is they're talking about kind of like cash break even. So usually when airlines are evaluating whether to keep a route or not, they're looking at like actual profit, so that there's all these expenses that you would include in the profitability of the route, like what are we paying at rent at the airports? Could this airplane be used in a different place more profitably? But here it's like, if we run this flight on this day, do we make slightly more cash than we would if we just sat the airplane down, continue to pay our people, and just didn't fly the airplane? So that's really, there's only two choices: sit the airplane, fly the airplane. Nobody's worried about sort of the extra costs running an airline.
That brings up kind of the problem of the day. We've gone through over the course of the last few weeks all of these quarterly earnings reports that, I mean, grim is generous. All of the big four major airlines lost at least $1.5 billion in a quarter, which, this time last year was really unthinkable. So, it's no secret that airlines are losing a ton of money right now. So I'm just curious kind of what your biggest takeaways were, from each or just a couple of, the United States major airlines, and whether you think that says more about, the past, the spring and when things were really kind of at their worst, or what it kind of holds for what the future of these airlines might be.
Yeah, I mean, the hope is that the recently completed second quarter is going to be the worst quarter in this entire period. Airlines have had several months now to get their cost structures in order. They have, of course, been helped by the fact that they're not paying most employee costs, but they all have this date circled of October 1st in their calendar. And unless Congress extends it, that's when the paycheck protection money runs out. So by October 1st, airlines are going to be smaller, they're going to be leaner, they're going to have fewer costs, and they're going to be, or they hope to be, set up for what might be a new normal. So something interesting was said in the United Airlines earnings call last week. Basically, like, they think that they can get to a return of about 50% demand before there's a real vaccine or therapeutic. So even in this kind of uneasy situation where nobody knows what's going on and the virus is not completely tamed, they think that, if the government gets serious and we get contact tracing and testing and all the things that we can get before there's a real cure, they can get back to 50% demand. And at that point, they say they can kind of break even. So that's kind of good news, right? Because you don't need 70%, 80%, 90% demand to come back. If you take your cost structure down and demand comes up a little bit more, you can get this new normal. I think that's what airlines are hoping for.
I mean, just as you have been bearish, as you mentioned, Scott Kirby has been more bearish than probably any airline CEO. Do you think that that 50% number, based on what we've seen so far, is that realistic in terms of getting to that kind of steady new normal for airlines, at least for the foreseeable future?
It's a little bit complicated, right? Because in this current situation in the United States, where there is no plan whatsoever to handle the virus, there's outbreaks all over the place. Nobody knows what's up, what's down. Everybody's very nervous. Some people don't want to go outside. It seems very hard to get to a 50% level. But you do see other countries outside of the United States, a Japan, a New Zealand, South Korea, that have done a pretty good job. And they still have the virus. They're going to have hotspots. They're going to have things that happen. But if we can just get to a point in the United States where there aren't so many cases and you can feel somewhat comfortable about flying, probably the 50% number is about right. I mean, everybody's guessing, but a lot of these airlines say, Alaska Airlines said it last week, there's basically three groups of customers right now. There's the group that's flying now, maybe it's about a third of people that say, you know what? I don't care about the virus. I want to go visit my mom, my dad. I want to do whatever I want to do, and I'm going to get on an airplane no matter what. They're flying already. The second group is a very important group to get to 50%. That's the group that says if it could just be a little bit safer, if I knew my risks going in, if I thought I might get the virus, but I probably wouldn't, I would get on an airplane. I don't think those people are flying now. And then there's the third group, and I feel like I'm probably in the third group. It's just not going to be flying for a while. It's just not in me. And airlines are not going to be able to attract those people until there's a reasonably effective vaccine or good therapeutics or something happens. But the first two groups are there, and airlines can make a pretty good living on those two groups, assuming the second group comes back.
Great. Everyone, if you're just tuning in, I'm Kyle. I'm the executive editor here at Thrifty Traveler, and I'm joined by Brian Summers from Skift, and we're talking about the future of the airline industry. Drop your questions in the chat. And speaking of, I'm going to add in a question here from Gene. Gene asks, Brian, do you see budget airlines staying in business, or do you think they may fizzle out?
Yeah, it's a good question. Usually in this sort of situation, budget airlines do fairly well. Um, the people who are flying are looking to go on vacation. They're probably looking to keep their own costs down, so they want a low fare airline. And airlines like Spirit, Allegiant, and Frontier have been doing this for years. They haven't been flying those business people paying big money for tickets, so they should be well positioned. Another thing that low cost carriers have going for them is they have shown over time that with $19 fares or $29 fares or $39 fares, they can actually make money because they pay their people less, they pay less for everything. They're a no frills airline. Now, going forward, American, United, Delta are probably all also going to have to compete for those $19 and $29 and $39 fare paying passengers. But because American, Delta, and United have such higher costs, it's harder for the big airlines to make money at those fares. So if you're Spirit, you're probably okay right now. But we've never seen anything like this, so we may have to watch it play out.
I think that brings up an important point. There are some people out there who, look at the Spirits and the Allegiance and Frontiers of the world and think, you know what, I'm never setting foot on one of those planes. And so when a question like Gene's comes up, they say, you know what, I don't care if they go out of business. That's great because I wasn't going to fly them anyway. But, these carriers, as you pointed out, put a ton of pressure on the Deltas and Uniteds and, these full service carriers to
Yeah.
actually compete on price. So if we were to see, even if we start talking about transatlantic services, if we were to see Norwegian Air collapse coming out of this, what is that, A, is that even possible, do you think? And B, what does that mean for the future of, what we've seen, which is, some of the cheapest airfare, especially to Europe, that
Yeah.
we've ever seen?
So I have some bad news for you, Kyle. Norwegian Air may technically be flying. They may not be in administration, which is the European form of bankruptcy, but they are effectively a shell of themselves. And they have said when they fly again transatlantic, they're going to stop doing a lot of the, for lack of a better word, crap that they've been doing the last 2 to 5 years. And so they're going to focus on thick routes, New York to Europe, Los Angeles to Europe. They've actually done pretty well with like LA, London. But a lot of people that live in second, third tier US cities, they're not going to see Norwegian again. That experiment, it didn't work at the time. And I don't know exact markets, but I think they were in places like, maybe they were in New Orleans. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. But it didn't work the way they hoped. So the transatlantic is going to see a complete reset of the operation there. Now, one thing I should mention is there are a lot of legacy airlines that have a lot of wide body airplanes, a lot of long range airplanes. You can use those airplanes, the A330, the 787, the 777 on domestic flights, but they were made to fly long haul. So I think eventually US and European airlines, the legacy ones, are going to fly across the transatlantic again. You have those big airplanes, you have a lot of capacity. I don't think transatlantic fares are going to shoot up for a long time. There isn't going to be that much business traffic. So there's going to be all these excess seats, even without Norwegian. You should be able to get a deal to go from the United States to Europe. Of course, this assumes that the Europeans let us in. Might be a while before any of that happens. Like if there's going to be a theme of this whole chat, Kyle, it's that there's going to be a complete reset in everything people are aware of, and so it's all going to change.
Right. And you brought up an important point that I think might be one of the biggest drivers in how things change, which is business travel. It's no secret right now that corporate travelers are not getting on planes. Airlines are not counting on that returning anytime soon. Bob Crandall did an interview with the Wall Street Journal today. Bob Crandall is the former CEO of American, and he said his guess is they maybe only see up to 50%, maybe 2/3 of the business travel that they had pre-COVID. And so the question is, this is critical to airlines, especially these legacy carriers that have built, their business around corporate travel. If that doesn't come back, what does that mean for everyone else?
Yeah. So I see two issues here. One is the short-term issue. You're basically having no business travelers right now, certainly not in any material numbers. There was some hope they would come back in the fall. They probably won't. The issue there is like this duty of care thing. If you work for a major corporation or even a mid-sized corporation, and your boss tells you to go on, a trip, a business trip, you're not going to want to go. You're going to blame them for making you go. You're going to be very upset. If somehow you get the virus, you might sue your company, anything like that. No company wants to be involved in telling their people they have to travel right now. It's a very different decision than you as a leisure traveler saying, I don't care about the virus. I want to go to Mexico. I want to go to North Carolina. So that's the short-term thing. Long term, I think, Bob Crandall and other people are talking about how much of the business travel will come back, like ever being 5 or 10 years. Because we're using video conferencing, because all these companies are going remote now, will there be less business travel? The answer to that is a little bit tougher to talk about, right? Because I know it seems easy right now to say that people will adapt and they won't travel as much for business. But, a lot of people had some assumptions after 9/11 about what travel would come back. People came back. It took many, many years to get back to those pre-2001 levels, but eventually it came back. I'm going to give you and your viewers a little bit of a secret because I've done a lot of business travel in my life. A lot of us like it. We like it a lot. And people in 2019, like here's another secret. some people would like come up with reasons they had to go on a business trip. Oh, I've got to do this. I've got to go here. I think it'll be a while before that comes back. But like, I could see a situation in 2030 where everybody has forgotten what happened in 2020 and people are coming up with new excuses why their company should send them on a business trip to Europe. And their meeting is on Friday and they're going to have to spend the whole weekend there. Business travel is intoxicating for a lot of people, and I wouldn't be surprised if it comes back.
Well, and depending on how many more of these Zoom calls we have to do, everyone is going to be sick of it.
I know, but this is actually a good one that you and I are having. I think we have pretty
Good,
good
good,
quality.
good. All right, so we've got a question here from Chris. Chris is from LA, and sounds like he flies mostly out of Burbank. And so he's asking what you see happening for these smaller, kind of more regional airports like Burbank.
So I just want to say I'm coming at you from my house in the Hollywood Hills, and Burbank Airport is like right there. It is the most convenient airport in the United States, and I would prefer that we not tell anyone our big secret about that. But you're right. You know, we've seen this after every other kind of economic disaster into airlines. In a place where there are multiple airports, airlines say, well, why are we paying people at, at Burbank Airport, Long Beach Airport, Ontario Airport here in the Los Angeles basin? Why are we paying for gate space in all these places? Why are we duplicating what we do? And so like here in Los Angeles, they all coalesce and they go back to LAX. And then as the economy improves, then they add more flights out of Burbank. So I realize that most people aren't familiar with Burbank, but it's a very convenient airport to Hollywood. It's a really cool small airport. You can get in and out easily. That was a big deal. Like in 2018 and 2019, we were seeing flights out of Burbank that we had never seen, or we had seen in the past, but not in the recent past. Flights to like Atlanta, Dallas, Fort Worth, Midway Airport in Chicago. Those may not come back for a while. I think that in any of these regions that have multiple airports, the big airport is going to win for a while.
And I know the Ontario airport is somewhere around you, and they had, I don't know if it started 1 year ago or two, nonstop
Yeah.
service to Taipei on China Airlines, which
They were
is crazy.
so excited about that. Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, it sounds crazier than it is, right? Because Ontario Airport is close to a very big Chinese American population, but I'm not sure that we're going to see many routes like that coming back anytime soon. And just to briefly talk about why. When times are very good, you can fill a flight from Taipei to Ontario Airport nearby where a lot of Asian Americans live. But when times are less good, you cannot fill that airplane with all those people going from point A to point B. So what you have to do is you have to stop at LAX, the big airport, and then you get your feed. You have people that transfer in LAX and they go to places like where you are in Minneapolis and Atlanta and Chicago. They take that second flight.
So, I mean, I think part of the new normal, is exactly what you're talking about. A lot fewer of these nonstop routes, whether it's domestic, but especially international, and making more
Right.
connections, even for people who live at what is a major U.S. airport, Minneapolis, like mine. Some routes are simply not going to come back. Is that a safe assumption?
They're not going to come back for a long time. And in your case, I would recommend that you get very comfortable with stopping in Amsterdam and Paris. For other people, it's going to be London or Frankfurt. We're going to be going back in time a little bit, and you're going to make that stop in Tokyo or wherever it is to get to your final destination.
Right. All right, another great question here from Daniel. Daniel is from Europe, and he's asking, in what way are we seeing airlines that are trying to survive already kind of learning from this and preparing for the next pandemic? And are we seeing that at all?
Wouldn't it be great if they were preparing for the next pandemic? I think in this particular situation, they're in so much trouble right now, they can't think about the next pandemic. Though I'll give you a caveat. A couple of airlines have come out recently and they said, you know, like any company, airlines have a worst case scenario. They say, if this happens, what do we do? If that happens, what do we do? And for the US airlines, they said, we have to have a balance sheet. We have to be prepared for another 9/11. if we shut down for 3 days, if demand doesn't come back for this long, we're going to be ready. But 9/11, it turns out, was a lot easier than the pandemic. So their new worst case scenario is going to be this and not 9/11.
Airlines got a lot of heat, especially as the first round of CARES Act funding started to come together with a package of payroll grants and loans. With consumers and everyday Americans asking, why should we be giving money to airlines that spent billions of dollars on stock buybacks? Now, there's a perfectly reasonable defense of stock buybacks. I won't ask you to make it, but the question is the appetite for those stock buybacks maybe decreased by this, not just now, but in the future, knowing that the next pandemic size kind of crisis for airlines may be around the corner?
Yeah, as you say, the answer to that is complicated because as a consumer, you hate buybacks. You'd love to talk about it. But, these airlines are publicly traded corporations with shareholders. If you don't have shareholders interested in buying your stock as an airline, you're in trouble. For whatever reason, actually, we know the reason, but shareholders appreciate stock buybacks because they make the stock, look better. And so, this is sort of a complicated issue. The good news is it's not going to be a problem for several years because you have to make money to be able to invest back in your own stock. But it's a nuanced issue, and I don't know that it's really necessary to get into right now because it's going to be so long until we have to think about it. But like the idea that they should have kept all that buyback money and put it in a rainy day fund in case a once in a century pandemic that nobody except like real serious scientists was thinking about, I think that's asking a lot of them.
Sure. Guys, if you're just tuning in, thanks for joining us. Please drop any questions you have in the chat here, and I will pull them up on screen, and Brian will answer them. Brian, another question for you. So as you look at how airlines, and I would say maybe in particular U.S. airlines, have responded to this crisis, it's just so clear how different the strategy is for each of them is. And I think in particular among the big three legacy carriers, but also looking at budget carriers as well. So I'm curious, kind of what stands out to you most, maybe about some of the, these big three airlines, what they're doing different from one another to try to chart a course through this.
Yeah, I mean, there really only are two things that airlines are doing almost anywhere in the world. You have some airlines that are going in hibernation mode, and that's United and Delta in the United States, and a few others, and many others around the world. And Qantas isn't going to be flying long haul for a very long time. And they just say, look, the old system is not going to work. We're just going to have to wait, get our cost structure down, and see what happens. And then you have a bunch of other airlines. We talked about them before, Southwest, American. We didn't talk about Spirit, but they're doing something similar. So is Allegiant, that say, look, this is the new normal. There are some people who are flying. We can't just go into hibernation mode, and let's make this work. Doug Parker, the CEO of American Airlines, had a colorful quote recently in the Wall Street Journal. It was something like, let's go fly. It was better than that. Yeah, we're used to air travel in the United States being almost a commodity, and all these airlines are doing almost exactly the same thing. That's not happening here. And I know you wanted to ask me another question just about, the marketing strategies of some airlines blocking seats and some not. But it's interesting to see them go different directions. There's no playbook for this.
Right. Yeah. And so, on that note, we have a good question here from Michaela. Who asks exactly what you just touched on. How long do you expect to see middle seats being blocked by a select few airlines? But also, we've seen pretty much across the board, every airline introducing some unprecedented flexibility to buy a fare for travel as far out now as June of 2021 and be able to cancel that or change it without paying a fee. How long do, these kind of more passenger friendly, frankly, policies last?
Is it passenger friendly? I mean, technically it is, but we need to look at why these change fees are being suspended. Airlines need money in the door. Even right now, with no change fees, if you buy a ticket with an airline and you change your mind, they don't send you the money back. They get to keep the money until you actually fly and they provide the service. So you're basically giving airlines a no interest loan, and you're giving them the money right now when they need it most. So I think that's why we're seeing no change fees. I actually expect no change fees will be around for a while. Airlines have to instill consumer confidence. They need that money in the door right now. And until things get noticeably better, I just can't imagine an airline coming out there and saying, well, actually, we have no idea what the situation is going to be in 6 or 9 months. Nobody knows if they're going to want to fly. But if you want to change, we're still going to charge you $200 or whatnot. The middle seats one is a little bit more complicated. The three big airlines blocking middle seats are JetBlue, Southwest, and Delta. Clearly, they've made a calculation. They also want money coming in the door, and they think that they're going to make more money blocking middle seats than they would selling to everyone and filling the whole airplane. Those are three airlines that have always cared about marketing and brand promise and some of the softer things about airlines. And you have American and United being more commodity-based airlines, and they've said, look, these are dire times. We have to fill every seat. Again, I'll probably remind you of this multiple times in this chat. I'm not an expert in public health or viruses, but at the same time, we've heard a lot of people come out and say, you're supposed to be 6 feet apart. Airplanes blocking the middle seat, there probably isn't any health reason to do it. So we have to start thinking about the blocking of middle seats, not as something that airlines are doing or not doing as far as public health, but it's a marketing strategy.
Yeah, are there any signs? Have you seen any data points, or maybe even anything in the slew of earnings reports that we've had recently that suggests that it is actually an effective marketing policy, or that basically Alaska, JetBlue, and Delta are throwing money out the door in terms of seats that are going unfilled?
Well, they're not necessarily throwing money out the door because load factors are so low. So you don't have that many flights that you're selling to capacity. For Delta, I think is the most interesting airline because for them, it doesn't appear to be a short-term strategy. Their CEO, Ed Bastian, believes that Delta made the biggest mistake in its history, in the early 2000s when Delta decided that it was going to compete with budget airlines by being a budget airline. So Ed Bastian always thinks in the long term, and I know this may be funny to people watching us because Delta is still an airline, but they want to be known as a premium airline. That was the case in 2018 and 2019, and Delta is now saying, when all this is over, we want people to remember that we treated them well, that we were a premium airline, because especially as United and American, Delta's top two competitors, go down market a little bit, Delta wants to be known in 2025 as the premium U.S. airline, the airline that you will pay extra to fly.
Given what we talked about before about business travel not returning to any meaningful levels anytime in the near future, is that a safe bet right now, do you think, to bet on a premium service? Are there enough of those, do you think, leisure travelers who are still willing to pay more for that kind of more premium reputation and service and product?
I think that Delta is playing a long game here. I think there are certain airlines, we haven't touched on this yet, but Southwest and JetBlue being two of them, that are using this situation to try to win market share in places they haven't been strong before. So JetBlue recently announced some new routes from LA, some new routes from Newark, places that they haven't been able to get gate space in the past. If you're looking at JetBlue's financials in the next 6 to 12 months, those new flights from Newark, from LA, they're just going to bleed cash. You don't go into a new market right now hoping that you're going to make money. And I think going back to Delta, it's the same thing. It's kind of like a wash about whether people are going to pay more money to fly Delta now. They're thinking far into the future. of, okay, are people going to remember what we did for them? We are going to be, the premium U.S. airline, right? You don't, I'm not going to say that they're going to be the Four Seasons hotels of airlines because they're still an airline, but they want to be thought of as a better airline than the others. They don't want it to be just American, United, Delta, they're all the same. Okay.
Sure. All right, we've got an interesting question here from Thomas. Thomas asks, I mean, he's basically asking what premium travel will look like, business and first class, especially internationally. The things that make travel, especially for business travel, a little more palatable, as Thomas puts it. What are those going to look like, not necessarily now, but in the future? What kind of long-term changes are we going to see, especially in, what we in the industry call that soft product for airlines?
Let me go check my crystal ball. I have no idea. I mean, I used to fly a lot of business class. I even would fly some first class. I mean, I think that there's a general idea that first class, which was already on its way out, may not survive this pandemic, except on a very, very few airlines. We saw Korean Airlines, I think, last week pull first class from almost every market. In the world. So it's going to be a world of business class only. I mean, I think that we have to be honest. And even if it wasn't a pandemic, even if it wasn't health related, if you just talk about the financial aspects of this, airlines are incurring so much debt right now. Most of them are going to make it, but there's so much debt. And anytime this has happened in the past, 2001, 2008, and 2009, they have to cut their CapEx budgets. And so a lot of these airlines have just put in relatively new business class seats. And like we saw in the last cycles, I mean, I think you're just gonna see these seats for a long time. There isn't going to be, oh well, every 5 years we're going to replace or even refresh the seats. The product you see now on these airplanes is going to be the product you see for a long time. Airlines in a situation like this, they cut the soft product, they cut the quality of food. If you had two pillows before, you may only have one. And then as things get
Heaven
better,
forbid.
that stuff comes back.
All right. I really like this question from Daniel, so I'm going to pull it up on the screen. Daniel asks, what's the future of airline alliances? So, we've got the three major airline alliances. One World is American's alliance, SkyTeam is Delta, Star Alliance is United. Are they going to get more important and stronger coming out of this, or
This
not?
is fascinating, Kyle. So the last 3 years, the only story people like me could write was that alliances were dead. Nobody cared about alliances. The airlines within alliances didn't like each other. And you had a bunch of airlines, Delta leading the way, that would create these joint ventures with other airlines around the world. So Delta might buy a piece of Aeromexico or Virgin Atlantic, and those airlines would be so much closer than any airlines within the alliances. So alliances didn't matter that much. You had British Airways with American Airlines, things like that. But now airlines are shrinking so much that you have an airline like American Airlines that was content to go at it alone or with its joint venture partners saying, you know what, wait a second, we need Alaska Airlines. And Alaska Airlines is now going to join One World, and it's all going to be seamless again. So airlines in the past were very worried about, they only wanted to partner with other airlines with whom they had very close relationships. And now I just don't think they're going to care that much. If I, it's a well-known fact, right? I'm a United Airlines loyalist. United in the past had done everything they possibly could to keep me on either United or, if I was going to Europe, the Lufthansa Group airlines. So you had an airline like SAS, which was a Star Alliance member, but it's very hard even to buy a SAS ticket with a United leg on United.com. And I think in the future, United's going to be like, you know what, we'll take partners anywhere we can. We'll find a way to share the revenue. It doesn't matter any much. It doesn't matter as much anymore.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I've thought a lot about this, and I keep coming back to some of the, frankly, what seems in retrospect to be really strange and almost foolish routes that airlines have flown from the United States in particular to why does Delta need to have a daily flight to both Glasgow and Edinburgh in Scotland? Why can't it do one, maybe add a tag flight where it flies from Edinburgh to Glasgow or vice versa, or just fly into Amsterdam and have KLM get passengers to up into Scotland? Do you think that is going to become part of the new norm? I mean, we talked before about, more connections, fewer nonstops, but especially when it comes to these alliances and partnerships, is that part of kind of the playbook?
Yeah, I think so. In 2018, 2019, there was like literally so much traffic that you had situations, and I don't know what the example is with the one that you gave, where like KLM would say to Delta, like, our fleet is maxed out. We can't do it. We're allowed to coordinate on these routes. Why don't you fly this route? We'll fly this route. We'll get maximum, effort out of our fleet. All this is going to change, and we're going to see a lot more connections at hubs. Now, I will go back. You talked about tag flights. Everything I've ever heard about tag flights is that they're just complete losers. They're so much more expensive than you could possibly imagine. Because if you're Delta and you're flying that tag flight, basically the pilots that flew the first leg can't fly the second leg, so you've got pilots all over the world kind of waiting to fly, flight attendants as well. But I will now say again that we are seeing, at least temporarily, some tag flights come back because you have these airlines that can't fill a Boeing 777 to go to a certain location. So they'll stop, and they've calculated it's cheaper to stop in one place, continue on to the next. We're seeing that with China flights. They're sometimes stopping in Seoul, going to China and coming back.
So the guys from Dots, Lines, and Destinations are pointing out that Glasgow and Edinburgh are an hour apart by car. So I just want to clarify, I was not suggesting that a tag
Thank you.
flight
It's just a
between
couple
those.
of dumb Americans speaking here. Apologies.
I'm not suggesting that is a wise business move. But they also point out, so I'm going to pull this up on the screen here, that JVs are even more valuable now, the joint venture partnerships.
Oh, there's
But
no doubt that JVs are sticking around and they're important. But it used to be only JVs. The rest of the airlines in the alliance, they just didn't matter at all. You do everything you could to keep passengers on your JV airlines and not on the alliance partners.
Is there, is part of that JV relationship looking, at least for now, kind of like a double-edged sword? Delta, you brought up being kind of the primary driver behind this, wrote down some huge losses in this last quarter because of the trouble that some of its JV partners are in. Is that cause for concern, do you think?
So there are two issues here. You don't Delta went ahead and bought very large pieces of its joint venture partners. Those required write-downs. Those may or may not have been a good idea. They don't look to be a good idea now. But when you have American and British Airways, when you have United and Lufthansa, those are just antitrust immune joint ventures where they share revenue, but nobody owns a piece of anyone else. So American, United, they aren't getting hit in the same way that Delta is. So you can have the joint venture without the investment.
Great. We've talked a lot about 9/11 and how, this pandemic has really just dwarfed what the previous version of the worst case scenario was for airlines. Out of 9/11, out of the Great Recession, we saw, a fair amount of mergers among the big airlines here in the United States. Do you think there is any potential for more mergers coming out of this?
Let me go back again and get that crystal ball.
Yeah, grab that for me quick.
Oh, it's so hard to say. I mean, people in the industry love to talk, and when they do talk, they talk about kind of the two undersized but essentially full service airlines in the United States, and that's JetBlue and Alaska Airlines. Both of them call themselves low cost carriers, but they're more mid cost carriers, and they're too small in places. But it's possible that they could merge with each other. We're now seeing American and JetBlue and American and Alaska all have relationships, so maybe one of them wants to tie up with American. It's hard to know. Everybody has always talked about Frontier and Spirit basically being the same airline. Why don't they merge? I don't know how much of an appetite there is today, but eventually all this could make sense.
Um, I keep thinking about Boeing CEO. It's probably a few months ago now, suggested kind of at the early stages, or what feels like the early stages of this pandemic, because time is irrelevant now, suggested that a major U.S. airline could collapse, not just file for bankruptcy, as I took it, but actually go out of business. Now, does that seem more or less likely to you?
Can I go to that crystal ball again?
Yep, yep, pull it out.
Look, there's no doubt that some U.S. airlines could be in major trouble the longer that this lasts. But we have seen with Paycheck Protection, we've seen with the CARES Act loans that the United States government has a vested interest in keeping some of these airlines going. After consolidation, there are now only three major U.S. global airlines. It's hard to see the US government saying we only want to be a two global airline country. And there's just something about it. We don't have flag carriers in the United States in the same way as countries abroad, but we're down to three: American, Delta, United. I really think that the US government is going to want to keep all of them in business. And so, you had a situation 30 years ago or so where like we let Pan Am go, we let Eastern go, we let TWA go, but that was a different time. We weren't down to three at that point. Um, I think that there's a way for all three brands to survive. If you talk about restructuring, of course, that's a different issue. Certainly, that's possible.
So if we go back to March, when Congress passed the CARES Act and decided to, give airlines financial support to cover payroll through the fall, or a good chunk of the fall, and also offer up some loans. I think the mindset then was we just need to buy airlines a little bit of time until demand comes back, and they can do this on their own. And now, as Congress is discussing another financial package, it has been made abundantly clear that there's no amount of time that Congress can meaningfully buy airlines to get to normal. That any financial support that they give airlines again would be, in a sense, delaying the inevitable, which is, as you've said from the outset, that airlines need to get smaller. So, this is kind of an uncomfortable question for both of us, but I'm just curious what you think, how that should inform, policymakers in terms of what they do to support that goal that you just laid out, which is, competition is good, and we want to have at least three major carriers in the United States.
Yeah. How naive was that back in March, right? And my guess is that it was naive even at the time, that if somebody had called Dr. Fauci and said, are things going to be back to normal in 6 months, he would have said, are you guys crazy? But anyways, that's what we ended up with. This paycheck protection thing is a little bit complicated, and you almost have to be an economist to really understand it and explain it, right? Because you don't want to see so many Americans, tens of thousands of Americans, lose their job. And it's almost like, again, this is above my pay grade, but it's almost like people are asking, is it better to have these people on unemployment? Or is it better for them to keep their job and then the government indirectly pays their salaries? Either way, for a while, these people are going to need government support. So I understand why a lot of airlines and a lot of unions are asking for an extension of payroll protection, even though it's becoming pretty obvious that another 6 months or even a year isn't going to buy us that much time. I suspect airlines are going to need more money from the government going forward, whether it's paycheck protection or loans. I don't know, but it's going to be a while until things get back to not just normal, but even that new normal that Scott Kirby was talking about, that we were talking about 45 minutes ago, where at least can you get to 50% demand with a good cost structure and try to wait it out.
Guys, if you're just tuning in, or if you have any other questions, we're kind of nearing the end here, but please drop in your questions. We'll maybe get one or two more in. Brian, I want to ask again, grab your crystal ball. What
Ah,
changes that we've seen in the past couple of months do you think might be here to stay for airlines, and then for travelers who are thinking about what the future of air travel might look for them?
yeah. So I think we have some good news on cleaning of airplanes. I was one of those people over the last several years, well before this, that traveled with my Clorox wipes. These airplanes, they like never got cleaned. Even in good financial times for airlines, they barely got cleaned. You never know what you would find on the tray table, things like that. I think a lot of the improvements in cleaning are here to stay because, like, let's be honest, the past was disgusting. Some of the other things that are here for a while are not so rosy. This might be the time when airlines say, we're going to give people less food, even in premium cabins. Maybe you bring your own food, except on the longest flights in the back of the airplane. You remember airlines made a big deal of bringing snacks back. They could do that in good times. And look, I know how ridiculous this sounds, but that little tiny bag of pretzels that you have with eight bags of eight pretzels in it is not expensive by itself. But think about how many bags of pretzels these airlines have to buy. And a lot of airlines now are giving these goodie bags with a bottled water and pretzels. I imagine that they just have the pretzels lying around. But I think maybe going forward, we're gonna see the end of that. And then just something else that we talked about a little bit before is less money being spent on the cabin interiors. It always kind of surprised me the last few years to hear so many airline passengers complaining about the quality of these flights. You're in Minneapolis, that Delta hub, so I come back to Delta. The Delta airplane cabin retrofit schedule was unlike anything anybody had seen in the United States in a very long time. You could get on a 30-year-old Boeing 757 on Delta, and it would look brand new. We've seen other airlines invest in their cabins a little bit. United certainly updates its cabins, but Delta was obsessed with that brand new look. JetBlue has been doing a cabin retrofit on its A320s. It just stopped it completely. So you're seeing like early 2000s interiors just going to be flying for the foreseeable future. I think for a very long time, airlines are essentially not going to touch their cabins. And it looks okay now because we've only been on pause for like 6 months. But 4 years from now, we're all going to get on these airplanes. That's going to be like a 2019 time warp.
Yeah, how grateful do Delta flyers have to be that Delta basically went through its entire fleet, except for probably the 717s and the Mad Dogs, which are gone now, and overhauled all of them. I mean, like you said, you get on an ancient 757 or 767, and it looks kind of pretty brand new for the most part. There's still a few old ones out there, but yeah, what timing.
Yeah, I know. I went to Delta Media Day a couple of years ago, and they parked a brand new A321 right next to a 757, and they had the media go on both. It was almost identical.
So telling. All right,
Yeah.
Brian, before we wrap up here, just tell me one or two things that you are going to miss about the old normal, the pre-COVID normal about air travel.
God, I miss everything about it. I mean, I used to travel all the time, and I'm here in Los Angeles, so I could get almost anywhere in the world I wanted to go nonstop, usually on my favorite airline. Um, and I'm here. We know that I fly United. I'd stop in the Polaris Lounge at LAX. I mean, that was like peak 2017, 2018, 2019. The fact that these airlines had the money and had the interest to invest in these, premium lounges. I imagine that United has a long-term lease for that space at LAX and other airports. So I'm sure that the lounge will continue, but it's none of that stuff is going to be the same as it was. We're going to look back on 2019 as peak time in airlines, but this is not forever. I remember when I started on the beat in about 2012. I talked to a lot of airline people just about routes, and airline people take routes very seriously. And at United, they would say, we used to fly here, we used to fly there, we used to fly there. They were talking about like the good old days of the late 90s. And eventually, by 2018, 2019, most of that stuff came back. Travel is intoxicating. Air travel is so much fun. I love it. It's an obsession of mine. I miss it. And I was telling somebody yesterday, it's not like we're covering retail department stores in shopping malls, right? If you cover Macy's, it's probably not coming back in any way that you ever remembered. But eventually, it's going to be safe to travel again. People are going to get back on airplanes. They're going to feel good about it. They're going to go travel again. And it's going to be off to the races again. And we're going to be like, remember that period in 2020 and 2021, probably, where nobody went everywhere? People said our airplane's dead. No, of course they're not dead. We're going to travel the world again. We're going to travel the country again. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be a while.
I am just personally so glad that I got on an A380 before this happened because aside from, probably Emirates and maybe British Airways, a lot of these are not going to fly again.
No,
And
they're
on
not.
that note, I'm sad I didn't get on a British Airways 747 because those are gone.
Yeah.
Brian,
End of an
thank you.
era.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I wish I really should have ended this on your hopeful note about how travel will return. But Brian, before we go, just remind everyone where they can find you, follow you on Twitter, whatever social platforms you think people should be following your work.
Sure. I work for Skift, Skift, skift.com. I'm on Twitter at Brian Summers, BrianSumers, Instagram at B Summers, and I look forward to getting in touch with anybody, anywhere.
Great. Brian, thanks again. Everyone, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're going to try and do these chats with people frequently, but this one is going to be really hard to top. So thanks again for tuning in and see you next time. Thanks again, Brian.
Thanks for having me.